We'll go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Housing and Racial Justice session. Thank you for joining us. Thank you also to Katie at TICO and Jen with Island Press for having us. My name is Christina Jackson, and I am an urban sociologist and professor at Stockton University, and I'll be your moderator for today. While I won't be formally presenting today, most of my work has been on increasing the stability of Black urban neighborhoods, and in particular, San Francisco, Atlantic City, and Philadelphia. So this topic is very near and dear to my heart. And I'll also drop some of my work in the chat for you to be able to see and later look at. So today we will hear from scholar activists and housing advocates who teach and research about the housing crisis in our cities, and in some cases, particularly Black neighborhoods. They will offer insights from cities across the nation, including Atlanta, Baltimore, and Los Angeles, about the history of migration and segregation, the social and economic geography of the space, as well as tangible policies, suggestions, and solutions that tackle the housing crisis in our country. I hope that we can also discuss what housing stability looks and feels like for the most vulnerable members of our community, including those housing insecure. I'll also be dropping in some links in the chat of some of the works of our panelists to check out for you all to look at later. So now I'd like to introduce our panelists for today. We have each of our panelists present for about 10 minutes or so, and then, or less, and then we'll have time for our question and answer. First up, we have Akira Drake Rodriguez, who is an assistant professor in the Department of City and Regional Planning at the Weitzman School of Design at University of Pennsylvania. So welcome. Next, we have Lawrence Brown, who is a visiting associate professor, the School of Medicine and Public Health at University of Wisconsin's Population Health Institute. Welcome. And lastly, we have Shane Phillips, who is the Housing Initiative Project Manager at the UCLA Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies. So welcome to you as well. Thank you for everyone for being here. So Akira, I will pass it off to you. And then when you're finished, we could just roll right into Lawrence's presentation. So I will stop sharing my screen. All right.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much to everyone at Island and TICO, especially Katie, and thanks to Christina, Lawrence, and Shane. I'm really excited to be in this panel and talking about this. This presentation will hopefully create some foundations for our discussion and the rest of the panelists by sort of examining some of the origins of racial and housing justice in the city. And I used the case of the city of Atlanta before the 1950s to sort of illustrate what these origins were. And so here, Atlanta was one of the earlier cities to sort of have a role in racial zoning. The famous sort of Supreme Court case, Carey v. Atlanta, helped establish that if you are going to use racial zones, they have to be equal. So if you are going to prevent African Americans from moving into white neighborhoods, you also have to prevent white people from moving into Black neighborhoods. And so because Atlanta was one urbanized a bit later than other cities as a result of the regimes of slavery, as well as tenant farming or sharecropping, you see some of these innovations on city planning and segregation occurring in Atlanta as a result. And so although racial zoning started in Baltimore, I'm sure Lawrence will touch on that soon, it was sort of exported to Richmond and almost perfected in Atlanta before going out across the country. And so this, in addition to the spatial sort of limitations of Black people by sort of being forced into 5 or 6 neighborhoods in the city of Atlanta, they were also politically constrained and marginalized as well. This is a white primary card from the city of Atlanta, which had a white Democratic primary, which is a private primary hosted by the Democratic Party for the state. that allowed basically white people to only participate in the only means of voting, again, in sort of a Democratic run city and state. This made it very, very difficult for Black people who made up, at this point, about 41% of the population to exercise their legitimate votes and citizenship in the city. However, public housing provided a bit of cover and citizenship for Black people in the city. These are two pamphlets from the first public housing developments in the nation. Atlanta had the first public housing with Techwood Homes that was constructed in 1936 during the New Deal. And so this provided opportunity for both white and Black residents to at least get access to standard housing. So this was an early slum clearance program, and this was an opportunity for both Black and whites in the submerged middle class, to be sure, as you'll see in these pamphlets. One on the left for the segregated Black John Hope homes and one on the right for the segregated white Clark Howell homes. The incomes were limited to sort of a minimum yearly income and a maximum income. And then this basically targeted the upper 2 and 3%, at least for the Black population. So in terms of creating a broad middle class, which was the purpose of the public housing program, particularly for white people, for Black people, the mobility was a bit more constrained. Other opportunities that arose was the production of a Black middle class, however, through the construction and the management and operations of public housing. So on the left, we have the slum clearance and construction of John Hope Homes, which is just near the Central Business District in the city of Atlanta. On the right, we have a picture of the first housing management staff for University Homes, which was the first Black public housing development in the city of Atlanta, built and opened in 1937. The Atlanta School of Social Work created a housing manager program that actually trained thousands of Black housing managers and sent them to public housing developments across the country. And so in terms of establishing a Black middle class, public housing had a role in creating professional management, but also sort of blue collar, such as construction jobs. However, in spite of racial zoning sort of being outlawed at the following the World War I, you still see that race is still being tracked in land use and planning in the city. And so you see these maps from early Bureau of Planning in the city of Atlanta, still tracing race and racial groups. Black people are limited again to about 5 or 6 areas. And this shapes how the city is planned and built and developed over the course of the early 20th century. However, opportunities still abound. You see here the staff from University Homes and John Hope Homes as early Black public housing development, interacting with Mayor William Hartsfield on the right, showing actually these are individual private homes that Black people were able to purchase as a result of staying in public housing and having the opportunity to save and create that type of housing justice. In the upper left-hand corner, you see this group of very serious men and women. This is the Black Kitchen Cabinet that worked with Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. The Black Kitchen Cabinet created a lot of the segregated programs that, while they were constrained, provided opportunity, particularly for people in the South who were unable to vote legally. However, with the end of the white primary that I discussed in 1946 in the city of Atlanta, Black people actually got a lot more political agency and were able to organize. However, this definitely scared white leaders such as Mayor Hartsfield here in the middle. In response, one of the first steps towards racial justice was the creation of Black police officers. 8 Black police officers were hired in 1948. However, they were restricted to only arresting Black people. They were forbidden from arresting white people, patrolling only Black neighborhoods, and segregated in their own police precinct in the Atlanta Black YMCA. These Black officers, however, were used largely as photo ops for the white mayor as a way of showing that Atlanta was a progressive city as related to race, but as a way to keep the city growing and attract investment from the Northeast that was currently deindustrializing. Here you see the response to this ability to vote. These are maps of the city of Atlanta in 1940 and 1950. You start to see a growing Black population, again, kind of limited to 4 or 5 areas in the city. Strong segregation here, even for a late urbanizing city. You can see the influence of racial zoning. In 1951, we see what is called the Plan of Improvement. The Plan of Improvement added an additional 74 square miles to the city of Atlanta and 100,000 residents, largely white, but it provided this western area for Black development. And so we see a ton of public housing develop in this northwest quadrant, and more so in the 60s and 70s. And you start to see a practical ghettoization of the Black community as a result of the right to vote that happened when the white primary was outlawed in 1946. And so there's direct evidence from Mayor Hartsfield that shows the need to expand the city of Atlanta was primarily to dilute the Black vote as a proportion of the total electorate, as well as provide an opportunity to constrain them in certain areas of the city. However, this opportunity or this marginalization spatially and politically of Black people by sort of limiting their political representation by having kind of a widespread population created this opportunity for political activism. And so we see here as public housing attracted more Black women and more single women-headed households, we see the needs and demands changing, and actually the relationship between tenants and housing managers becoming more antagonistic. Black women start to accuse the state of what they are, which is a slumlord. So we see rent strikes, we see direct action, we see occupation as a means towards housing, racial, but also gender justice in the city. Black women also use planning and protest as a means of increasing their own political legitimacy. We see here Mary Sanford on the left, who is testifying at a MARTA meeting, which is the Metropolitan Atlanta Regional Transit Authority. She helped with others to sort of create a direct link for Black women who worked in the northwest quadrant of the city that we saw with an increasing Black population get to the northern area of the city, thank you, Christina, where they often worked as domestics. On the right, we have Ethel Mae Matthews, who was one of the founders of the Welfare Rights Organization in Atlanta, the local chapter. Here is putting claims on the state by saying that the legislature is responsible for hunger and poverty. And so public housing also served as a space where people could organize, but also put claims on the state by talking directly to them through the multiple avenues such as tenant associations, HUD regional meetings, and other sort of spaces of activism in public housing. Finally, I kind of want to end here because I think it dovetails nicely to where I'm thinking Lawrence Brown is going to go, but thinking about Atlanta as a Black mecca. And so these problems still persist in the city of Atlanta, which although it was the first city to have public housing demolish virtually all of it by the 2000s for the hosting of the 1996 Olympics. And it did so while under this very large Black urban regime. They've had a Black mayor in the city since 1974 and a majority Black city council since 1982, although both of those things are changing. However, this image of Black Atlanta wanted respectability. So we start to see, even with back-to-back mayors, we see here on the left, Andy Young, and on the right, Maynard Jackson Jr. Those were the first 2 Black mayors in the city of Atlanta, always carrying this politics of respectability. And we see that that also sort of limits the possibilities for housing and racial justice in a contemporary city. So I'll stop there and hand off to Lawrence.